Everyone in this room likely has a device with them that contains a system on a chip. That's because mobile phones in particular contain a small integrated circuit with several electronic components like USB controllers, processors, power management circuits, etc. on it. That small integrated circuit is an SoC. There's a long and complex design flow that results in an SoC being ready for purchase and integrated into a device. At a very high level, owners of electronic design intellectual property, or IP owners, spend enormous time and resources to design their IP. Often, the IP owners collaborate to design complex IPs. The SoC integrator then combines all IPs into a single design and sends to the foundry for fabrication of the SoC. In this talk, we'll focus only on security issues in the design phase. That is, till the SoC integrator sends the final SoC design to the foundry. A competing IP owner or the SoC integrator are potential adversaries in this design process, as they can steal, modify, and integrate IPs of other developers with their own without the knowledge of the latter. In the last 15 years, the global sale of semiconductors, which is in billions of dollars, has increased sevenfold. The annual loss due to IP piracy was estimated to be around $1.1 billion in 2015 alone. Not only that, 46% of manufacturers on average are hit by IP theft, and 80% of piracy is as a result of internal design theft. The P1735 standard was introduced to stop IP piracy in the design phase. The core cryptographic mechanism that it uses is something called a digital envelope. I'll describe this in more detail in a moment, but at a very high level, it is a cryptographic object that contains the encryption of the IP owner's plaintext product. Most often, the plaintext IP is some electronic component described in a human-readable language, like VHDL or Verilog RTL. The P1735 digital envelope is meant to protect the confidentiality of IP and thereby foster trust and participation in the distributed SoC design process. Sadly, we saw that P1735 in fact offers essentially no protection to IP owners. We find a surprising number of cryptographic mistakes in the standard. These mistakes enable attack vectors that allow us to recover the entire underlying plaintext IP. Some of these attack vectors are well known. For example, the padding oracle attack. Others are new and developed by us. As we'll see, our attacks can be mounted by any party with access to a commercial EDA tool. EDA here stands for Electronics Design and Automation. These tools are commonly used by IP owners to produce their IP and by SoC integrators to carry out integration of IP, functional testing, and so on. Our attacks are also very efficient. Using a single license of an EDA tool, the standard padding oracle attack with some aggressive optimization recovers a soft IP core of 4,000 lines of code within 7 hours. To give you some perspective, an AES core is less than 800 lines of code. Our new attack outperforms the padding oracle attack with some loss in accuracy though. It recovers 90% of the same IP in just 42 minutes. In most cases, a bit of familiarity with the high-level language in which the plaintext is written allows one to boost this 90% to 100%. Before going to the attacks, let me explain the structure of the P1735 digital envelope. It consists of 3 parts: the data block that contains the private portions of the IP and is protected using a symmetric encryption scheme, the writes block, which in turn contains a key block that holds a ciphertext of the key used to encrypt the data block and is encrypted under the public key of the receiver's EDA tool. The unprotected data block that holds the non-private portions of the IP. The standard mandates AES CBC mode for encrypting the data block and RSA-based encryption for the key block. Note that the AES key is encrypted under the public key of the receiver's EDA tool. Let us see how the P1735 digital envelope fits into the overall workflow. The IP owner develops its IP using a particular EDA tool. It then encrypts the private portions of the IP using AES CBC to get the data block, and then encrypts the symmetric key with the public key of the receiver's EDA tool provider to get the key block. Then the IP owner bundles together the key block, the data block, and the non-private portions of the IP into a digital envelope and sends it to another IP owner or SOC integrator that has access to the same EDA tool. Remember, the SOC integrator and the receiving IP owner are potential adversaries. When provided with the digital envelope as input, the EDA tool can recover the plaintext IP using its secret key and then compile and execute it to display only the permitted output. For example, this output might be a gate and wire representation of the IP called a netlist. The promise of the P1735 digital envelope is that the receiver learns nothing more than the permitted output, in particular what the writes block allows. Note that the sender and the receiver may be using different EDA tools. For example, the sender may be using a Synopsys EDA tool while the receiver a Xilinx. P1735 makes this interoperability possible by providing a common markup syntax for the RTL. This common markup syntax is a critical part of the SOC design flow, and I'm highlighting it because it's going to come up again towards the end of the talk. Let's see how an adversary can exploit the workflow of the standard. After receiving the digital envelope, the adversary can maul the data block of the digital envelope and give it as input to the EDA tool. Decryption will not fail as there is no authentication check on the data block. Notice that the HMAC tag covers the writes block only. Now the decrypted plaintext will differ from the original plaintext, and during compilation, the tool will report errors to the adversary in a log file. As you probably know, decryption errors have often been exploited to recover plaintext. The classic example is Wardener's padding oracle attack on CBC mode, which we'll discuss shortly in context of P1735. Just a reminder, Wardener's attack was reported in 2002. Let's look at a concrete example involving an EDA tool. Simplify Premier, an EDA tool by Synopsys, exactly followed all recommendations of the standard and made necessary assumptions where the standard was vague. Sadly, the standard is vague or even silent on some security critical matters. For example, how to pad plaintext prior to CBC mode encryption. The Synopsys tool chose to implement the commonly used PKCS 7 padding scheme. This padding, combined with the error messages that the tool makes visible, allowed us to mount Wardener's attack to recover the plaintext IP. Let me quickly remind you of how the padding oracle attack works, and in particular, how it works within the P1735 workflow. CBC mode requires ciphertext to be block aligned. To do this, there are many standard padding schemes. For example, PKCS 7. In this scheme, if the last block is short by one character, hex value 01 is appended at the end. If it is short by 2 bytes, then hex value 02 is appended twice, and so on. Naturally, if after decryption the padding is not proper, the decryption oracle will report a padding error. Let's see how the padding error can be used to recover the plaintext with a simple example, where the plaintext is 30 bytes long and the last block is padded with hex 02 twice. Given the ciphertext, the adversary knows two things about the second plaintext block. That after decryption, it contains one of the valid PKCS 7 padding bytes, and when it modifies any byte in the first ciphertext block, the byte at the same index in the second plaintext block also gets modified. In the padding oracle attack, the adversary XORs the last byte of the first ciphertext block with hex 01 and a guess of the plaintext value G. Say it chooses hex 41 as the guess value. Next, it queries the decryption oracle with the modified ciphertext. After decryption, the last byte in the plaintext will be hex 42, which is not a valid PKCS 7 padding. So the decryption oracle will report a padding error. This is a cue for the adversary to choose a new guess value. Say it chooses hex 02 and queries the decryption oracle with the modified ciphertext. This time, after decryption, the last byte in the plaintext is hex 01, which is a valid PKCS 7 padding, and therefore the oracle will not report any error, indicating that the guess was correct. In the P1735 workflow, the adversary can maul the data block as in a standard padding oracle attack, construct the digital envelope in the usual manner, and ask the EDA tool to perform decryption. Post decryption, if the tool detects an invalid padding, it does not give any error. Rather, it shows a warning message, encrypted data mangled, and stores it in the log file of the tool. The adversary can use the presence or absence of this warning message in the log file as a padding oracle. Luckily, there are ways to mitigate this attack. The simplest would be to suppress the error message. Or one could replace the PKCS 7 padding with one that does not have any invalid padding, like A byte or PKCS 7, or OZ padding, I'm sorry. From a cryptographic perspective, the best option would be to not use CBC mode at all, rather switching to a mode that does not require any padding, like counter mode. But I want to be clear that any of these fixes only mitigates the padding oracle attack, and none of them stops the new attack that I'm about to describe in a moment. Before I do that, I just said that the simplest fix would be to suppress the error messages that enables the padding oracle attack. But let's turn to the standard to see what it has to say about error messages. To paraphrase the standard, error messages are essential and harmless. Specifically, let's look at some codes. All tools do error checking and report errors and warnings to the user. The quality of those error messages reflects on the usability of those tools, and by extension, the quality of protected IP. Moreover, the standard states it's highly unlikely that information in error messages will fundamentally compromise the IP and allow essential information to be stolen. Therefore, there is a good argument that protected IP is more usable with error messages, and the risk of loss of value will be little to none. Okay, one might argue that the padding error message has nothing to do with the protected IP and is strictly an artifact of the way encryption was done. Fair enough. Then let's assume that the padding error is suppressed. Can we find other error messages that could be used akin to the padding error? Well, as we just saw on the last slide, the standard strongly suggests that useful EDA tools should provide descriptive error messages when passing the decrypted IP. As I mentioned earlier, soft IP codes are human readable and are written in a hardware description language like Verilog or VHDL. In Verilog, the backcode character, which you see in the orange box, is used to define macros like include, define, undef, etc. However, if the backcode character is not followed by these predefined keywords, then it reports one of two specific errors. One, the unknown macro, or expecting identifier immediately following backcode. We can exploit these error messages to mount a new attack called the syntax oracle attack. At a high level, the syntax oracle attack is similar to the padding oracle attack, except instead of padding errors, the adversary can use the discussed syntax errors to guess the plaintext IP. In order to induce the syntax errors, the adversary replaces the target ciphertext character with a guess of the plaintext character. Next, it queries the syntax oracle. The oracle decrypts the IP and performs a syntax check and returns back the error messages, if any, back to the adversary. If the oracle returned one of the two specific errors we discussed, then the adversary stops and computes the actual value by XORing the original value of the target ciphertext character with the correct guessed value and hex 60, which is the ASCII value of the backcode character. In the P1735 workflow, like the padding oracle attack, the adversary can maul the data block, as explained in the previous slide, construct the digital envelope, and ask the EDA tool to decrypt and perform a syntax check on the resulting plaintext. If the tool detects any syntax error, it reports back those errors in a log file to the adversary. The adversary can use the presence or absence of the two errors in the log file as a syntax oracle. Note that these errors are specific to the commonly used Verilog RTL language. there may be errors in other languages as well, which can be used in a similar manner. Large industrial IPs can result in data blocks containing on the order of 10,000 ciphertext blocks. For such large ciphertexts, the basic syntax oracle or padding oracle attack can take years to complete using a single EDA tool license. One could argue that the adversary could procure multiple licenses of the EDA tool and recover the plaintext IP in a shorter time by parallelizing. That's true, but these licenses cost upwards of $10,000. So let's look at some optimizations that do not require purchasing multiple licenses. Recall that CBC mode encryption is using AES, which has a block size of 16 bytes. And our plaintext alphabet consists of the 256 ASCII characters. Naively, the syntax oracle attack takes a maximum of 256 times 16 attempts per ciphertext block. So for an n-block ciphertext to find the entire plaintext, the tool may be required to carry out 256 times 16 times n squared decryptions. Where did this extra factor of n come from? Recall that in each attempt, the tool has to decrypt the entire n-block ciphertext. We make the attack efficient using several optimizations. In the first optimization, we reduce the number of AES operations by tweaking our attacks such that the sample space of guessed characters is restricted to valid Verilog characters and not the full ASCII alphabet. Further, we realized that we do not need to decrypt all ciphertext blocks while trying to recover plaintext from the target ciphertext block. In fact, we need just 4 blocks to run our attack against a specific block of ciphertext. This reduces the number of AES operations to being linear in n rather than quadratic. In our final optimization, we exploit the inherent properties of languages like Verilog to run the attack on all blocks in parallel, but using a single license, which reduces the number of AES operations to just 128 times n. Please see the paper for details as to how these optimizations work. Now let us look at the performance of the attacks. We ran our experiments with Synopsys Simplify Premier EDA tool on IPs of different sizes and functionality, and measured accuracy of the attack in terms of the percentage of plaintext that was recovered. The IPs were selected from OpenCourse, which is the largest community for the development of open source semiconductor IPs. Note that our attack works on any IP encrypted using the P1735 standard. In this graph, I'm showing you the time in seconds to recover the entire plaintext IP as a function of the number of ciphertext blocks present in the data block. The timescale is running from 10 seconds to 10,000 seconds to 100,000 seconds, and the number of ciphertext blocks runs from 10 to 10,000 blocks. For example, a 9,000 block ciphertext takes 2,500 seconds to recover the entire IP using the syntax oracle attack and 25,000 seconds to using the padding oracle attack. In this graph, I'm showing you the accuracy of both attacks with the most aggressive optimization technique as a function of the lines of codes in the IP. You'll notice that the padding oracle attack has 100% accuracy, and this is not surprising because the reporting of the padding error has nothing to do with the higher level processing of the plaintext that the tool performs. Whereas the syntax oracle attack rests entirely on this higher level processing. And so sometimes the specific error that we are trying to cause can be masked. For example, by padding errors occurring before the syntax check happens, or by comment characters inadvertently being introduced as we maul the ciphertext. And the likelihood of this happening increases as we more aggressively optimize for performance. With no optimization, the syntax oracle and the padding oracle attacks are essentially equivalent in terms of accuracy and the running time. With the most aggressive optimization, which is what I'm showing you in this figure as well as the earlier one, the accuracy of the syntax oracle attack is 85.3% on average compared to 100% in case of the padding oracle attack, but is nearly 16 times faster than the padding oracle attack. I want to stress that both attacks work on any IP encrypted using the P1735 standard. So P1735 standard completely fails to deliver on the promise of protecting the confidentiality of IP and really does nothing to prevent IP piracy. But IP piracy is not always restricted to theft. For example, the interested party may also try to insert malicious circuitry or hardware trojans into legitimate IP in order to steal information from the system or even shut down the systems that are part of critical infrastructure. It turns out that the attacker can insert a hardware Trojan of his choosing into a softcore IP written in Verilog and encrypted using P1735. Upon receiving the target digital envelope, the attacker first recovers the plaintext IP using one of the attacks I just described. With the plaintext IP in hand, it is actually trivial to insert a hardware Trojan and create a new valid P1735 digital envelope. The adversary can choose a new AES key, encrypt the plaintext data block, which now contains the private portions of the IP and the hardware Trojan under this key, and then encrypt the AES key with the RSA public key of the tool provider and assemble the digital envelope. What I'm going to show you next is how to insert an arbitrary hardware Trojan by touching only the data block and in particular without any knowledge of the original AES key. Again, consider the CBC mode ciphertext that comprises the data block. Assume the ciphertext contains only two blocks, the IV and ciphertext C1. Before tampering with any block, we create two more copies of C1. Let's call them A1 and B1 and append it at the end of C1. So now the resulting ciphertext is concatenation of IV, C1, A1, and B1. In the first step of the attack, we altered the first 2 bytes of the IV in order to introduce a start of comment block, the slash and start, as the first 2 characters of the first plaintext block. To do this, we again exploit the structure of CBC mode and knowledge of the actual plaintext. We XOR the IV with P1 and any string of 8 bytes that has slash star as the first 2 characters. Note that when the resulting plaintext is processed, everything following slash star and until a closing star slash will be treated as a comment. We can modify A sub 1 in a similar way to how the IV was altered to insert the closing comment characters in the first 2 bytes, another opening block comments in the last 2 bytes, and 12 bytes of the plaintext IP and Trojan as the remaining characters. All this modification is done in the third plaintext block. We can then repeat this process to insert the remaining characters of the IP and the Trojan. In fact, any targeted hardware Trojan of any size can be inserted into any IP encrypted with P1735 using tools that are standard compliant. Next, we concatenate the ciphertext blocks to get the new data block and then plug in the original key block and the unprotected data block to get the digital envelope with the hardware Trojan and send it to the next entity in the supply chain. So the IP with the Trojan will now make its way into the final SOC. Notice that the key block is not modified in this attack. For demonstration, we inserted hardware Trojan in an AES IP core that leaks the secret on-chip key when given a specific message as input. Yet, it behaves correctly on every other input. This makes the Trojan difficult to detect, but easy for the attacker to later trigger. As most of you would be thinking, a simple fix to thwart all of these attacks is to use an authenticated encryption scheme. Indeed, we recommend mandating an authenticated encryption scheme with support for associated data. While the key block and the unprotected data block constitute the associated data, the private portions of the IP that go into the data block acts as the plaintext. An AEAD scheme takes these two inputs along with a key and a nonce and outputs a ciphertext and a tag. In the P1735 context, the ciphertext will be the data block and the tag will replace the HMAC tag that covers only the writes block. The simplest way to achieve this would be to extend the scope of the HMAC tag to the entire envelope instead of restricting it to only the writes block, and to make sure that if the new HMAC tag fails, to verify upon decryption that no further receiver-side processing is done. But this simple change entails a significant number of changes in the standard and its implementations. Minimally, the standard needs to deprecate previous versions of the standard, with no support for backward compatibility. It also needs to define standard-specific variables or pragmas for the AEAD scheme and define the revamped markup format of the digital envelope to allow interoperability of different design flows. Most importantly, it has to explicitly define the behavior of the tool when decryption fails due to any reason. The EDA tools which implement the recommendations of the standard need to identify the decrypted versions of the digital envelope and stop further processing of the IP. In case an AEAD scheme is standardized, they need to add new APIs that the IP owners could use to create the digital envelope. Also, they have to add error flags and messages in their compiler to catch errors due to the AEAD scheme. Not only that, they have to avoid conflating cryptographic error messages with language-specific error messages. These are the minimal changes that we have enlisted. The actual number of changes would be substantial. So it is worth evaluating other probably secure AEAD schemes with respect to their efficiency and operational considerations. While these changes might stop the attacks we give, other attacks might emerge due to the vague specifications in many parts of the standard. To summarize, IP piracy is a major problem, costing billions of dollars in losses each year. To prevent such piracy in the design phase, the P1735 standard was introduced. EDA vendors like Simplify and Xilinx adopted the standard to protect their clients. However, these tools which comply with the P1735 standard enable attacks that allow recovery of a substantial portion of IP in a very short time. Not only that, insertion of hardware Trojans into IP is also possible. These attacks make the standard useless. So IP piracy in the design phase still remains a major problem, and all IP encrypted using the P1735 should consider themselves at risk. Thank you.
Can you said that your attack works if you don't use the optimizations with higher accuracy.
Right.
Can you, on those blocks that you don't recover, just then reapply it with lower optimizations and recover everything?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. Could you repeat?
If you, on those blocks that you fail to recover, can you then rerun the attack at a lower level of...
Yeah, sure, we can do that. Yeah.
So you could get full recovery even
Absolutely, yeah, we can get a full recovery, but the time of the attack will be a little bit more. So if we are constrained at the time level, then you can recover 90% or maybe 85% of the IP in a short time. And if you have more time, then go for the higher accuracy, but which take more time to recover the rest of the portion.
But you don't have to use the higher accuracy on the whole thing, just on the 10% remaining.
Yeah, sure, you can do it.
Thank you.